Welcome to the Tales of Deception YouTube channel, where we explore emotional stories and uncover hidden aspects of family and social relationships. Our goal is to broaden your perspective, offering deeper insights into the complexities and unspoken feelings that we often overlook. Subscribe to join us as we experience these unexpected and meaningful stories together. Today, we'll dive into the story of Leah, a woman caught in a difficult situation that forever changes her family dynamics and marital relationship. Let's begin.
It was an ordinary evening, or at least it seemed so. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of amber and gold. In our cozy little home, the aroma of dinner filled the air, a comforting reminder of the simple life I thought we had. My husband Thomas was at work, just like always, working late into the night, as he did for as long as I could remember. And my father-in-law, Mr. Charles, sat in his usual armchair, reading a book, a calm and steady presence in our home. But little did I know, everything was about to change in the most unexpected way. I had just finished preparing dinner when I began to feel unusually warm, the heat of the day still clinging to my skin. I decided to take a shower to cool off, the water soothing as it poured over me. I wrapped myself in a soft towel afterward, and the stress of the day seemed to melt away for a brief moment. But when I tried to put on my dress, something went terribly wrong. The zipper of my favorite beige silk dress got stuck, and no matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't budge. Frustration set in. I considered calling Thomas, but when I stepped into the living room, I saw that he wasn't home. Mr. Charles was, though, and I knew I had no choice but to ask for his help. "Can you help me with this zipper?" I asked, my voice unsure. My words, though simple, felt heavier than they should have. I hesitated, unsure if I truly needed help or if I was reaching out for something more, something I hadn't yet acknowledged. Mr. Charles didn't hesitate. He put his book down slowly and without a word stood up. His movements were deliberate, controlled, just as they always were, but something about the way he approached felt different now. As he stepped closer, I noticed the space between us seemed to shrink, suffocating the air with an unspoken tension. It wasn't that he was doing anything wrong, but there was a strange, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, one that I couldn't ignore. The calm reassurance that he had always exuded now felt like an unfamiliar weight. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but the subtle change in the air made it almost impossible to ignore. I turned my back to him almost instinctively, allowing him easier access to the zipper. The act of turning felt almost deliberate, as if I was both pulling away and inviting him in at the same time. His hand brushed against the fabric of my dress, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through my spine, though I tried to dismiss it. His grip on the zipper was firm but gentle, as though he was trying not to cause any discomfort. Yet, I could feel the tension in the air growing heavier with each second. His fingers worked on the stubborn zipper, pulling it with a steady rhythm, but there was something in his movements that made the moment feel charged with something I couldn't quite put into words. I closed my eyes for a brief second, trying to regain my composure, but the feeling of his touch lingered on my skin like a whisper, an electric pulse that made my heart race. Then, in one swift motion, the zipper slipped down with a soft, sudden sound. My breath caught in my throat as I felt the dress loosen around me. Before I could react, the fabric pulled around my feet, leaving me standing there, exposed. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked in place. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to do something, to step away, but my body refused to obey. I was standing there, vulnerable, caught in a moment that felt both surreal and all too real. The air grew thick with something unsaid. The silence was deafening. I could hear the faint rush of blood in my ears, the steady beat of my heart as it pounded painfully against my chest. I was bare, physically and emotionally, and I wasn't sure how to react. Mr. Charles quickly turned away. His face flushed a deep red. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," he stammered, but his words didn't quite reach me. The apology was too late, and it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. His voice, though filled with regret, felt distant, muffled by the chaos in my own head. I couldn't speak. My lips parted, but no words came out. I wanted to say something, anything, but nothing seemed adequate. Nothing could undo the sudden shift in our dynamic. I could feel my hands trembling as I bent down to gather the dress, pulling it back up to cover myself. My fingers were unsteady, as though the simple task had become monumental. The air around us felt charged, thick with a tension I couldn't shake off. I wanted to look at him to see if he felt the same weight in the room, but I couldn't. I couldn't bear to look at him, to meet his gaze, to face the reality of what had just happened. The silence stretched on between us, uncomfortable and suffocating, and I couldn't escape it. My heart raced in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The moment lingered in the air, unbearable. And yet I couldn't seem to make it stop. I finally spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay," I said, though the words felt hollow. I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes, to acknowledge what had passed between us. But I didn't know what else to say. I didn't know what had just happened, and I certainly didn't know how to fix it. In the days following that moment, things started to feel off. It wasn't just the lingering awkwardness between us, but the subtle changes in Mr. Charles's behavior. These changes, which I couldn't ignore, made me question myself, even though I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things. For the first time in years, he started avoiding my gaze. Our conversations, which had always been smooth and natural, now felt forced, like he was trying to maintain a distance that I couldn't understand. Every time I looked at him, I noticed his gaze quickly shifting away, and it made me feel even more uncomfortable. Yet at times when I least expected it, I would catch him staring at me, his eyes searching for something. Every time I accidentally locked eyes with him, I saw a quiet, unspoken search, as though he was trying to find something in me that I couldn't put into words. Those moments made my heart race, and I couldn't help but feel an uneasy mix of fear and something I couldn't quite grasp. A part of me wanted to be scared, but another part felt curious, drawn to what I couldn't understand. I told myself I was just overthinking it, that I was being paranoid. After all, nothing had happened, right? I looked at myself, trying to figure out if I was reacting too strongly. After all, he was my husband's father, a man I had always respected. Nothing could be wrong. But deep inside there was a gnawing feeling, a reminder that something had shifted. A line had been crossed, even if only in my mind. I tried to push those thoughts away, but they wouldn't go. That feeling was too strong to ignore. His evasive glances, the way he seemed to avoid me when it wasn't necessary, only made it worse. I knew deep down that the dynamics between us had changed. But I told myself that time would heal it, that things would go back to normal. And then it happened again. We were in the house just like every other day. But this time, something felt different. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and Mr. Charles stood nearby, quietly watching me. That feeling, the one I had been trying to deny, surged back. His gaze the same as before, but this time I couldn't look away. I could feel his eyes on me, not just in passing but fixed on me longer than usual. It felt as though he was pulling me into a space I couldn't escape, a space I didn't know how to navigate. "Leah," he said, his voice low, slower than usual. "Are you okay?" I turned to face him, our eyes meeting for a brief moment, and in that instant, I felt trapped by an invisible thread he was pulling. I couldn't respond right away, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I couldn't separate the emotions that were swirling inside me. I nodded, trying to stay calm, but the tension in the air was too much to ignore. "I'm fine," I replied, trying to ease the moment, but my words felt empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and I could tell from his expression that he knew it too. We continued with our tasks, but there was a strange quietness between us. The silence grew, and I could feel it pressing against me, suffocating any chance of normalcy. The change between us wasn't something I could ignore anymore. It was there, unspoken but real, and it was making everything feel tense and uncertain. It was a quiet morning, and Thomas had already left for work. The house felt unusually still, almost suffocating. There was something in the silence that weighed heavily on me, something I couldn't shake. The air was thick with thoughts I wasn't ready to confront, thick with everything I had tried to bury deep inside. My body was tired, exhausted, really drained from the stress of the past few days, and the weight of the unspoken between Mr. Charles and me hung like a cloud over the house. I had become accustomed to the tension, but today it felt heavier, more suffocating than usual. I shuffled through the house in my pajamas, aimlessly moving from room to room. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Fresh air? A distraction? Something to lift the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to settle in every corner of the house. But when I stepped into the living room and saw Mr. Charles sitting there, my heart skipped a beat. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that felt almost physical, like they were pulling me into a place I didn't want to go. The room seemed to shrink around me, my breath catching in my throat as I felt trapped under the weight of his gaze. "Are you not feeling well?" he asked, his voice softer, lower than usual, like he was leaning in closer even though he was sitting across the room from me. I nodded, trying to hide the discomfort I was feeling, but it was clear from the way my body tensed that something wasn't right. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew. His gaze never left mine, and it was so focused, so intense, that I could feel it like a touch against my skin. The air between us felt charged. Every second stretched on, thick with a strange energy I couldn't describe. I should have looked away. I should have said something, anything to break the tension, but I couldn't. His stare held me there, anchored in place. It was like he was waiting for something from me, something that I couldn't give him, but I couldn't pull away either. The silence between us was suffocating. "Leah," he said again, his voice trembling this time, as if he was saying something he wasn't sure he should. "You're so beautiful." His words hit me like a slap across the face, though they were soft, almost whispered. My heart stopped for a beat. I froze, caught off guard. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. How could he say that? Was he joking? Was he serious? My mind screamed for me to break the spell, to tell him to stop, to remind him of who I was and where the lines should be drawn, but nothing came out. His eyes were serious, no trace of humor, no softness that could make his words feel like nothing. He meant it. And that realization hit me harder than anything else. For a moment, everything around us ceased to exist. It was just me and him in that room, the air between us thick with the weight of his words. I wanted to speak, to tell him how wrong this was, how dangerous his words were, but I couldn't. The moment felt suspended in time, as though nothing existed outside the silence we shared. His gaze never wavered. It was like he was waiting for me to respond, waiting for me to acknowledge what he had just said. But how could I? What was I supposed to say? My thoughts were in chaos, my mind racing with 1,000 different emotions. Shock, confusion, fear, and an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't name. I could feel my skin growing hot, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't break eye contact. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around me as I stood there, paralyzed. His words echoed in my mind over and over again. "You're so beautiful." It wasn't just a compliment. It felt like something more, something darker. I should have said something. I should have walked away. But instead I stood there, my body frozen, caught between fear and confusion. His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had just been said. The silence stretched, and I realized I couldn't stay in this moment forever. Slowly, I forced myself to look away, to break the connection, to find some way to get away from the intensity of it all. But the damage had been done. The words had been said. And in that moment, everything between us changed. After several moments of unbearable silence, Mr. Charles took a step toward me. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he was weighing each step carefully. The air around us felt thick, charged with something heavy, something that neither of us could escape. I could hear the faintest sound of his breath, shallow and uneven, as though he too was struggling to hold it together. I could feel his presence encroaching on my space, on my mind. The distance between us had always been a comfort, a barrier that kept things simple, safe. But now every inch felt like a mile, and the space between us seemed to shrink with each breath I took. I should have moved away, I should have said something, but my body refused to obey. My legs felt like lead, unable to carry me away from him. He stopped just a few feet away. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. I wanted to look away, to escape, but something in the way he was looking at me kept me rooted to the spot. It was as if his eyes were holding me captive, not physically but mentally, emotionally. I couldn't break free, even though every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, to get away from the suffocating tension. "I don't know why this is happening," he whispered, his voice soft but filled with guilt and regret. It was a tone I hadn't heard from him before. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something raw, something vulnerable. But I can't stop thinking about you. The words hit me like a wave crashing against the shore, pulling me under. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the weight of what he had just said was too much for me to carry. My heart started racing, pounding in my chest as if it wanted to break free. I took a step back, instinctively trying to distance myself, but I was still frozen in place. My thoughts were a blur, a cacophony of emotions that I couldn't make sense of. This was wrong. Everything about it screamed that it was wrong. This wasn't supposed to happen, not between us, not like this. But still I couldn't move. His words, heavy with an emotion I couldn't quite grasp, held me in place. It was as if the world around us had stopped. The room seemed to shrink, the silence becoming deafening. I wanted to scream, to tell him to stop, to make him understand how wrong this was. But all I could do was stand there, paralyzed. I felt trapped in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, like time itself was suspended, waiting for me to react. The weight of his confession was suffocating. I had never imagined that something like this could happen, especially not with him. I had trusted him, respected him, and yet here we were, standing in this impossible, dangerous moment. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Part of me wanted to run, to shut him out completely. But another part of me, one I couldn't control, was drawn to him, captivated by the intensity of his gaze, by the way he was looking at me as if I was the only thing that mattered in that moment. I knew I should move, I knew I should say something, anything to break this unbearable tension. But the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed, trapped in a moment that felt like it was both fleeting and eternal. I wanted to scream, but my voice was gone. I wanted to push him away, to tell him how wrong this was, but I couldn't. Instead, I stood there, lost in the moment, unable to escape. For what seemed like an eternity, we stood in silence, neither of us moving, neither of us speaking. The air between us was thick with everything we hadn't said, everything that was left unsaid, and it was suffocating. My mind raced, but my body was still, locked in place by a fear I couldn't name. Fear of what he had said, fear of what I was feeling, fear of what this meant for us, for everything I had built, for everything I had believed in. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The guilt, the confusion, it was all too much. It weighed on me every moment of every day. A constant pressure that never let up. I had tried to push it aside, telling myself it was just a bad phase, something that would pass. But it didn't. It festered inside me, eating away at everything I thought I knew about myself, about my life. The feeling of betrayal, not just to Thomas but to myself, was unbearable. How could I let it get this far? How could I allow myself to be trapped in this impossible situation, torn between loyalty to my husband and the suffocating reality of what had happened with Mr. Charles? Every moment felt like I was suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. I had to get away for my own sake, for the sake of my marriage, and for the sake of everything I had built. That night, after a tense dinner with Thomas, I knew what I had to do. The quiet between us at the table had never been louder. He was there, physically present but emotionally distant. His focus was on the meal, the task at hand, while I couldn't even bring myself to look at him. Every word that passed between us was forced, like we were both acting, pretending that everything was normal when nothing felt right. I wanted to tell him, wanted to confess, but the fear of what it would do to him, to our marriage, held me back. The weight of the secret was crushing. As we finished dinner, I could feel my hands shaking. I knew this conversation had to happen, but I didn't know how to begin. Thomas was still oblivious, his mind occupied with work, his usual distractions. But I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to be honest with him, even if it meant destroying everything. "Thomas," I said softly, my voice trembling. He looked up at me, his eyes tired, as if he hadn't really seen me in a long time. "I think we should move out," I continued, the words spilling out in a rush, like a dam that had finally broken. "I need space." I could see the surprise flash in his eyes, followed by confusion. The silence that followed felt like a void, a chasm that I had just opened between us. The words were harder to say than I imagined, but they were out there now, hanging in the air between us, a fragile truth that felt both freeing and terrifying. I had finally said it. I had finally taken the first step toward what I knew needed to happen. But I wasn't prepared for the weight of that decision. Thomas didn't speak at first. He just stared at me. His expression unreadable. I could see his mind working, trying to process what I had just said. I wanted to say more, to explain myself, but I couldn't. The tension in the air was too thick. Too suffocating. I felt like I was drowning in it. And then, just as I was about to speak again, Mr. Charles appeared in the doorway. His presence, calm and unruffled, seemed to punctuate the moment in a way that made it feel more final, more real. He walked in slowly, his usual controlled demeanor only adding to the weight of the moment. His eyes met mine for a brief second, and I could see the unspoken understanding between us. There was no going back from this. "Leah's right, Thomas," Mr. Charles said, his voice steady and calm. Almost too calm. "Maybe some distance is what you both need." The way he spoke, as if it was already decided, as if he was part of the decision, made everything feel so much more concrete. It was as though he had pushed me over the edge, giving me the final nudge to make the choice I had been too afraid to make on my own. Thomas didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked between me and Mr. Charles, confusion and hurt clear in his eyes. I saw the betrayal there, the realization that something had shifted, something had broken. But I couldn't take it back. I couldn't undo what had been done. "I'll pack," Thomas finally said, his voice tight with emotion. He stood up slowly, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. I could see the pain in his eyes, the hurt that I had caused, and it nearly broke me. But I knew it was the only way. I had to face the consequences of my actions, no matter how painful. And so we stood there in the heavy silence, the finality of it all settling in. The decision was made. We were going to separate. For now at least. For me, for Thomas, for everything that had been shattered. The weight of it hung in the air, and there was no escaping it.
The story ends with Leah making the decision to leave, realizing that sometimes, the best way to protect what's left of a broken family is to step away. She understands the lessons learned, the importance of boundaries, the fragility of relationships, and the consequences of a single moment of weakness. But even as she walks away, the pain and guilt will follow her, a reminder of the irreversible choices that were made. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe to share the journey with us. Stay tuned for more intriguing stories coming your way.